After witnessing serious misconduct and naively believing that I would be safe, I blew the whistle. This was before the PSDPA came into force, but I don't believe it would have protected me anyway.
You wake up more.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
So from the moment a whistleblower begins to question what is going on, they are tagged as threats to the organization, as troublemakers to be dealt with, and all efforts are focused on destroying them and sending a warning message to others. The consequence of failing to protect whistleblowers is that we fail to protect ourselves because the wrongdoers prosper, they gain more power, and they go on to cause even more harm.
I've studied whistleblowing for over a decade. But just as importantly, I myself was a whistleblower in 2006. A former naval officer, I joined the Federal Public Service after the 9/11 attacks. I quickly rose to be Chief of Transportation Security Regulations at Transport Canada. After witnessing serious misconduct and naively believing that I would be safe, I blew the whistle. This was before the PSDPA came into force, but I don't believe it would have protected me anyway. The reaction was overwhelming as the resources of the entire department were swiftly mobilized against me. I was falsely accused of security breaches and harassment. When a colleague and I fought back using the grievance process, the complaint was heard by one of the implicated individuals. It was maddening to experience so many abuses of authority, assisted by human resources and the department's integrity officer. After going through both the PSDPA and Bill C-290 painstakingly, my conclusion is that the PSDPA fails every major category of our criteria. As Mr. Hutton has observed, critical failures render it useless to nearly all whistleblowers. Bill C-290 does significantly improve the PSDPA and is an excellent start, but it is not enough to make the PSDPA effective. There remain some critical failures. First, many people who believe they are protected will not be protected because of the requirement for magic words. That is, their disclosure was not said in exactly the right form or to the exactly right person. Second, there is still no duty to actively protect the whistleblower from the instant they speak up. Instead, whistleblowers must endure reprisals, typically for years, before they can even apply for some form of redress. By this time, most are broken and give up, and the public interest issue dies. Third, there is no interim relief from reprisal for whistleblowers. Perversely, there is interim relief for those accused of reprisals. Fourth, the Integrity Commissioner still doesn't have any powers, special powers, to investigate complaints of reprisal. Departments can simply stonewall. Fifth, processes to correct the wrongdoing remain fundamentally flawed, as there is no standard for competence or timeliness of investigations. Departmental investigations are especially vulnerable to interference. Sixth, while the requirement for 5-year reviews is positive, measuring or auditing the performance of the regime is still impossible. In sum, whistleblowers remain consistently disadvantaged and wrongdoers get the benefit of the doubt. To properly fix the PSDPA will require more changes. In general, future revisions must approach the law with a different mindset. Protecting the whistleblower must be the priority, not an afterthought, because keeping the whistleblower safe ensures that the wrongdoing isn't swept under the carpet. Investigations should meet standards of competence and be completed in a reasonable time. Whistleblowers should be able to rebut evidence from implicated officials. I'll conclude with an important point that's sometimes missed by people who haven't experienced a reprisal. Whistleblowing systems must be designed for the worst case scenario. Whatever limits you might imagine would temper reprisals, such as structural and legal checks and balances, common sense, or even normal human decency, discard them from your minds. Whistleblowing regimes must be constructed as if those implicated will ignore such constraints, because the more serious the wrongdoing, the more powerful the wrongdoers, the more likely that is to happen.
Here we are today discussing this issue at a time when very recently the media has reported on receiving information from someone at CSIS alleging foreign interference in our elections. And sadly, it would appear that the Prime Minister was more seized with finding out who that individual was or is rather than the nature of the allegations. In her testimony and a written submission, Ms. Forward states that, and I quote, "Legislation alone will not protect whistleblowers. The overriding factor for success is culture." And I shared in the previous panel that I am very familiar with an old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I'm not sure if it eats legislation for breakfast, but I'm wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on how we change the culture in the public service.
To that first, I think we have to start with the law. Now, the sequence that I've heard is informed public outrage, which leads to enormous pressure on politicians, which leads to law. That's the sequence, and that's what we've seen in other countries. We have no shortage of scandals that should have caused outrage in Canada, but we haven't had people in the streets and people going to jail. I can assure you that if the law is changed so that some of these wrongdoers suffer consequences, that will be the start of a significant culture change throughout the whole public service. The very first one that it happens, the message will go out like a cannon shot. And I'll point out the case of in the UK not so long ago, the CEO of Barclays Bank was personally fined over $600 million. Now, his crime was not the wrongdoing he was accused of, because that was not considered serious. It was attempting to uncover the whistleblower. He went to great lengths to find out who the whistleblower was, and you can imagine what his intentions were. And he was fined more than $600 million for doing that. So that sends a signal, and that might cause other CEOs to think twice about, launching a campaign to find this leaker.
Thank you.
If I could add anything, it would be that if you want to improve the culture at the top of the public service, and I'll agree with the previous witnesses that that's where it probably needs to happen, you would want to also have a look at the way they're socialized. I would say that you would want to look at how they're hired, socialized, and incentivized, because as it stands right now, senior public servants are mainly rewarded for making problems go away, not for fixing the problem necessarily.
Mr. Braun, in your assessment of Bill C-290, you made the observation, and I will quote it. You state that the improvements this bill may, and I quote, act as a Trojan horse, luring unwitting whistleblowers with illusory protection. And I think the last thing we want to do is have the appearance of doing something when in fact we're not. We want to address doing nothing, but we don't want to pretend or be fooled into thinking that we're doing something when we're not. And so I guess what I would ask you, and you identified the 5 categories that are needed in order for whistleblowing protections to be effective. How can we improve this bill right now so that it offers substantive protections to whistleblowers?
Are you asking for a specific list of fixes?
Or two recommendations. We need some recommendations to go forward with in order to improve this bill so that it isn't, in fact, the Trojan horse.
We keep hearing this request for 1 or 2 things, and you got a good answer past the bill. The second thing is make the bill stronger. Clearly, in our judgment, there's no possibility of substantially changing the outcomes, which are totally unacceptable, of this bill without some changes, significant changes. We have some ideas for some that can be implemented within the limitations of the rules here for a private member's bill, but there are going to be some that are really important that we can't address, that are going to be critical, and if those are not fixed, the system will still not work properly. What we suggest you do is take on the task of identifying those as well, knowing that they will not make it into the private member's bill, but they are something that the committee can also report on if you so choose, because you're going to have plenty of opportunity to do that. You're going to hear some wonderful testimony from Tom Devine, who has been a tremendous support to us and helped us with our criteria, and from other people, Anna Myers. You're going to hear from some people who are extraordinarily knowledgeable and help you identify what needs to be done.
By creating this tribunal as a way station, would that diminish the role of the PSIC as you'd see it, and be would that then imply that for those who are being accused of wrongdoing, that there would be an obligation for government to provide some type of extend some legal services to them so that they can defend themselves in case they were wrongfully being accused of doing wrongdoing?
Well, you raised several good points there. One is that a feature of our current system is it's completely sealed off from the real world, in the sense that there's no access to the courts, there's no access through access to information, to any of the information brought forward regarding wrongdoing, for example. It disappears forever. And the tribunal is deeply flawed. We've said from the start that that there should be access to the courts, to the regular courts, with the normal rules regarding judges and so on, and that's been denied here. So that certainly ought to be available. And one of the things I point out, the only way that people can challenge decisions of the tribunal is through judicial review and decisions of the commissioner as well. And every single judicial review, I think without exception, has excoriated the decisions of the integrity commissioner. And yet that doesn't amount to redress, because a judicial review does not allow them to replace their own ruling. And so that's a huge problem in the Act. And even though it's expensive and difficult, that access to the proper courts has to be there as a kind of check and balance that the tribunal is doing its job, and it can be overruled if it's distorting the law and finding against whistleblowers when it should not.
It's interesting. You look at these officers of parliament, these roles that are created, and the government has, through governor and council appointments, has the ultimate say. And sometimes Parliament could be left with a choice to either, accept the government's recommendation or leave you're choosing to leave the role vacant by not ratifying our selection. I would just draw to your attention the current vacancy in the office of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner, and there's very stringent requirements on who can be appointed, the credentials required to be appointed to that role, including to be a former federal court judge. Now, the Judges Act sets the salary for what a judge makes, and the new ethics commissioner will receive 40% less than a judge. So the pool of qualified individuals they're looking to draw from is now said, if you're interested in this position, you'll earn 40% less, but we assure you that we take this work very seriously. So there's different ways for them to interfere. So I take your I take your suggestion well, and will refer to the documents that you referenced. I'm sorry that I don't have more time. Thanks very much.